We're live. Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, everyone. I hope you're all well, inshallah. I have a very special guest joining me today from the States. The sister is originally from the former USSR region, the Caucasus Mountains to be exact. Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, sister. How are you?
Walaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I'm good. How are you?
I'm very good, thank you. Thank you for coming on today. You've got a very interesting story. And as Muslims, we are a global ummah, so I believe that we all need to be informed about all of our brothers and sisters around the world. And you personally can provide a lot of insight for us, specifically about Russia and the former Soviet Union. But before we get into all of that, I sort of would like just to give yourself to give a brief introduction about yourself in terms of your background and maybe your Islamic upbringing as well.
Of course. Well, first of all, I want to say thank you so much for inviting me, because that same day I had a conversation with a friend of mine that I want to spread the information to more people. And then literally I come back from the coffee date with her and I see your email and I text her and I said, "You're never leaving my life," because I feel like this was meant to be and it was perfect timing. So thank you.
So nice to hear. No, I'm so glad to have you on.
Thank you. So, about me, I am a content creator. I am someone who is trying to tell people more about Russia through authentic interviews as well as real stories of people from Russia. I was raised and I grew up in Russia my whole life. So, I'm a fluent native speaker of Russian. And I'm also a Muslim, alhamdulillah. And I'm a Caucasian, which is why myself, my family, and my ancestors, we have been Muslims for, I would say, at least 7 generations now. Before we continue with the other questions, I wanted to say that I'm not here to form or change anybody's opinion about Russia. I'm here to share my lived experience. So just like with anything in life, please do your own research before you come to conclusions.
Inshallah.
Yeah. So that's a little bit about me.
No, that's good, alhamdulillah. I notice that sort of no matter where Muslim people are, or whatever background they're from, we sort of connect due to similarities in our Islamic upbringings. What was your Islamic upbringing like in sort of the Caucasian Mountains?
So I would say my Islamic upbringing may be similar to a lot of people who lived through communistic regimes. So as you know that Lenin has said famously, religion is opium for nations. And mosques were shut down anywhere where communism was practiced. So my religious upbringing, I guess conscious religious upbringing, happened when I turned 14, 13. So I remember my cousin was saying that, hey, I started praying, guess you can learn Fatiha in one day. I was like, I can try too. Can you give it to me? So he wrote it on a piece of paper. None of us speak Arabic, so from the get-go. But he wrote the transliteration of Fatiha, and he just gave it to me on a piece of paper. I said, well, let me read it. Maybe I can. So I remember that was 13. I was 13 years old. I started praying. And when I was 14, I started wearing hijab. And this is where some people who grew up in the communistic regimes can relate to. Wearing obvious attributes of religion is not something that we were used to. My mom didn't wear hijab. My grandma didn't wear hijab. I would say about 3 generations of my family didn't wear hijabs because they lived under the Soviet regime. So when I started wearing, it was a complete shock to everybody. First thing people thought, oh, she's in love with some, I don't know if I can say the words, but the T word.
Yes.
She's in love with some bad guy who is gonna, I guess, send her to Syria or something. So that was the very first impression I received from my relatives. When I realized that, well, I'm in love with my books. Okay, I'm straight A student. I'm not even looking at guys. I'm observing my shoes most of the time. So that's not the case. So you can relax. The second question was, but what's going on with you then? And I remember my mom asking me to go to a psychologist in my school to speak to my internal mental situation, mental condition. I said, I'm great. I don't need to speak to the psychologist at that time. And so that was it. She didn't continue. She didn't push me. over time, as she started to realize that nothing is wrong, that people are just starting to go back to their roots. Because you have to realize when you live in Russia and you speak the language, you often adapt the culture of the people that you live around. It happens to people in America too. But it was hard to adapt their culture because we were different religions. So I realized if I'm not them, who am I? And that's how my Islamic journey, I guess, self-upbringing began. That said, I'm very grateful to my parents for providing the foundations of modesty, the foundations of respect, and foundations of being a good person and being a good Muslim.
That's interesting. It's interesting your hijab journey, because I think a lot of parents, if their daughter was to wear hijab, they would be, happy or encourage it as Muslim parents. But I guess your parents were just trying to protect you from maybe what they, were worried about. But like I said, as Muslims, we can connect with our similarities in our upbringing. It's something that bonds us together. It's from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We're all one ummah, of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and we're so blessed to be so, especially in this day and age. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless your parents and your family. And I'm glad that they they calmed down and they weren't too stressed. So as I said previously, you're currently based in America, like you said, but both Russia and America are global superpowers with thriving economies. Why did you and your family leave Russia to move to the United States?
I think the short answer would be religious persecutions. And the long answer will require a deeper dive into history. And I don't want to put everyone to sleep in the first 5 minutes. So maybe we can come back to this later if you're up for it.
Yes. Yeah, no, definitely. I think I can understand sort of religiously why you probably wanted to move. And I'm glad that you found somewhere safe to live in, with peace and safety. But from your experience, it does sound like there's a prejudice towards Muslims in Russia from what you've said so far. And I've heard from other people about Islam not being viewed favorably on a public and a political level over there, especially in the past. Though to be completely fair, I have also heard some people say that recently there is a shift happening somewhat in a positive direction. But from your personal experience, how are Muslim people treated specifically in Russia, and what is the general perception of Islam over there?
So the relationship between Islam and Russia, how do I put it? It's complicated. It's layered with the policies of century of expansions, colonialism, genocides, forced conversions, and deportations. So I guess I do have to do a deep dive into history. So I guess, guys, grab a snack or a drink, and I'm going to take you on a wild ride. And honestly, if there's one thing to take away from this interview, I would say is the historical context of how Muslims were treated in Russia and are treated now. So let me take you through a couple of steps in history that will give you a more adequate answer to this question.
Please.
First things first. Russia never, in its historic borders, never had Muslims. Let me just even get comfortable, because this is a very, very, very interesting point. In its historic borders, Russia never had Muslims. Russia started to have Muslims as a result of its expansionist policy. And it started in 1500s with this person called Ivan the Terrible. That's his actual title. It was a Tsar in Russia who began expanding in the Kazan Khanate. Kazan Khanate are the people that we know today as Tatars. When the expansion happened in Kazan Khanate, they forcibly converted a lot of Tatars into Christianity. The ones who didn't convert, they were either killed, or the ones that were particularly smart, they pretended to be Christians, but they were Muslims. Now, one other reason why that expansion happened is because actually Tatars were sitting on a very lucrative branch of Silk Road. So when they were Russians expanding in that area, what they did is to prevent Tatars and Muslims from continuing to prosper, they moved the Muslim communities, 30 kilometers away from the center city and 20 kilometers away from major roads. So that's how Tatars, who are now the second largest ethnicity in Russia, became part of Russia. Now, let's move to very quickly. I hope people don't fall asleep. So let's move very quickly to the Caucasus and how did Caucasians people like Chechens and Dagestanis became part of Russia. Islam spread in Dagestan in the 8th century, or in that region in general. And in the 1800s, Russia began what's called a Caucasian War. It's a brutal campaign to not just achieve a victory, but to totally dominate the region. One of the things that that era is very known for is the first modern genocide in modern history, which is genocide against Circassian people. 90% by 1960s, 90% of Circassians were killed. The ones that were not killed, they fled to Ottoman Empire. They nowadays Turkey, Syria, Jordan, and Iraq. So this is why, fun fact if you didn't know, there are Arab speakers who are refugees, who are Circassians by their origin. And they're the children of refugees that came from the Caucasus. Another thing that is very important to mention is that there was a group of people called Kazakhs, and the people helped tremendously Russia to conquer the Caucasus. Now, why do I mention this? Is because when I started to follow what's happening in Gaza, I started to really learn more about the Israeli kibbutzim. And I realized that, wait a second, my people also have similar experience with people called Kazakhs. So Kazakhs used to be serfs or slaves who ran away from Russia because, frankly, people who lived in Russia, Russians themselves, they also didn't have a good life under the Russian Empire. They ran away to the Caucasus to seek refuge in the Muslim communities, and those Muslim communities protected them, gave them clothing and food because they are up in the mountains. Once you get in the mountains, it's hard to get you out of there. Now, the outcasts turned into the fierce defenders of the Russian Empire, and they created a communal, almost like kibbutzim, self-sufficient groups that were protecting, I guess, or fighting on behalf of Russia during the Caucasian War. Now, I want to mention one more thing that is super important to understand. I know everybody knows about USSR, and now it's nothing new that religion was prohibited. But there's one thing that a lot of people don't know. This is, it's called mass deportations that happened with Chechens, Ingush people, as well as the Crimean Tatars. Now, imagine this. This is World War II. You went to fight to protect your family. And when you come back, you find out that your father, your mother, your wife, your kids were deported to a land you don't know about because Stalin considered them a traitor.
Oh my gosh.
A lot of those people actually died on their journeys to the destinations, later learned that they were sent to Siberia and Central Asia. One thing that I find particularly disturbing is the fact that there was no bathroom on the trains that they were put on. Basically, it's like they were like cattle put on trains. And the Russian soldiers would stop and say, hey, relieve yourself in open fields. But a lot of people decided to throw themselves under machine gun fire and chose death over humiliation. Now, I know I said a lot, but give me one more thing that I want to share with you.
Very interesting, sister, please.
Okay, so this is very, very important. This is also that a lot of people don't know. And the reason why is because we are very close community when it comes to newspapers and information in general. We are reserved by nature. We feel ashamed when we share our victimization. But I'm not ashamed. No. So I will share this. When USSR helped defeat the Nazi Germany, and USSR suffered 26 million people loss to do that. And undeniably, I believe if it wasn't for USSR and its immense sacrifice, we would not have defeated Nazism. Now, when they did defeat the Nazism, ironically, neo-Nazism as an ideology grew like mushrooms in Soviet Union. In the late USSR era, in the early 2000s, the groups that were now known as skinheads started to attack minorities from Central Asia, from the Caucasus, Caucasians, as well as foreign students from African countries. And they were in every single city, but mostly in Moscow and St. Petersburg, with an estimated, I think it was 50,000 active skinheads, at least. Now, police was very tolerant towards that, and even Kremlin used them occasionally to counter democratic uprisings. I remember from history that it happened especially during the Orange Revolution in Ukraine. I say this to say that history doesn't go anywhere, and the legacy lingers. And if we jump now in today's Russia, what do we have? On one hand, and I promise this is my last point. On one hand, we have Muslim communities that are prosperous, that have imams appointed by the head imam in the country who works with the government. They're often called traditional Muslims. I think traditional in this case means the Muslim version of Islam that has survived through centuries of oppression. That's what we've been practicing, and that's the traditional version. It also happens to be the version that the government accepts. On the other hand, we have Muslims who are politically, socially, and economically active and who oppose this approach. And unfortunately, often they are the ones that get targeted the most. Yeah, so that would be probably the very short version of the historical context to understand the relationship between Islam and in Russia. But I didn't even mention Central Asia, because Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan and ex-USSR countries also have suffered a lot when it comes to their religious identity. But, it's tough all around. And I feel that the resilience is the name of the game here, really.
Firstly, I want to say, sister, take as long as you need to explain the history and whatever points you want, please. The stage is yours, and it's very interesting. I didn't know any of that. I actually learned about the Soviet Union in school. It was one of my favorite topics in history, but I did not hear about anything to do with Muslims, or of course you would never hear about any of this or be taught any of this. So it's very interesting. And like I said, I've heard positives and negatives about Russia, but it's mostly been negative, to be completely honest. I've heard a brief history of Russia's conflicts with Muslim nations like Afghanistan and Syria in the past. Obviously, in more recent times, with the success of Muslim UFC fighters, from Russian republics like Dagestan and Chechnya, it gives people the impression that things are much more religiously diverse over there than maybe they are in reality, like you said. But speaking of Chechnya, recently there was a viral video of the Russian president, Vladimir Putin, visiting a Chechen mosque. I don't know if you saw it, where he was gifted a gold-encrusted copy of the Qur'an. He kissed it and he hugged it in a gesture of respect. I also saw on RT News recently that Moscow had allowed women to wear their hijab in passport photos. So what are your thoughts of this sort of change, of Putin kissing the Quran and Russia allowing hijab in passport pictures? Is this propaganda, do you think, or is this progress?
I think I know. Yeah, I think I know which one you're referring to.
Yeah.
And I can imagine that this was pretty impactful for Muslims in the West and in the world, in the Western world, because can you imagine Biden, the leader of the supposed free world, kissing a Quran?
I know.
I think he will be hated by both Republicans and Democrats, to be honest. And the supposed war criminal Putin did it. It was also, I think, one of the things that Arab leaders really appreciated him for. After all, they have an endearing term for him, Abu Ali Putin. So personally, if I look at this as a standalone event, I think it's fantastic. I think it's admirable. But if I look at it from the perspective of Muslims who practice the very Quran that he kissed, who are being forced to go to war in Ukraine and sometimes kidnapped, it's no longer black and white. So,
yeah.
What do I know? I'm just a girl.
No, that's interesting. And what do you think about them now allowing women to wear hijab in passport photos? Do you think that's propaganda as well?
I think it's a question of, whether it's okay to be allowed to have hijab in your passport photo if you're Palestinian, but be under occupation.
Interesting. No, very interesting. It's not always black and white, like you said. And, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make it easy for our brothers and sisters that are over there. We mentioned you are specifically from the Caucasus Mountains, and this is not a region only exclusive to parts of Russia, but it also spans across other nations that were formerly part of the Soviet Union, and also Eastern Europe, and even spanning to European intersection with Asia, which was very interesting when I read about it. Can you please educate the viewers on the region of the Caucasus Mountains in regards to which countries and republics it covers?
Of course. So, generally speaking, the Caucasus region is between two seas, the Caspian and the Black Sea. And it has two parts. There's a northern part, which comprises of places like Chechnya, Dagestan, Kabardino-Balkaria, Karacháyevo-Cherkessia, North Ossetia. That's on one side. And then we have the south, which is Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia. They all have different languages, by the way. For example, some of places even have more than one. Fun fact, actually, the Caucasus is one of the most linguistically rich places in the world. Dagestan alone has more than 30 ethnic groups and more than 30 languages, indigenous languages. So, but religiously speaking, Dagestan and the north of the Caucasus are Sunnis. Now, the south, Azerbaijan, are predominantly Shias. Georgians are Georgian Orthodox, and Armenians are predominantly Armenian Orthodox. However, this is a very fascinating fact. We all have the same, how do I say, code of conduct, because we have the same term we use to describe us. It's Caucasians. We have the same, I guess, the way we were raised. It's very difficult to explain, but it makes a lot of sense because we shared so much history together. And even if I see a Georgian who's Orthodox Christian, I will be, to be honest, very connected with them, as opposed to, say, someone who's Christian and is from Russia, and I lived in Russia my whole life, just because of this shared heritage. Now, I have to mention 3 groups of people who are not originally from the Caucasus, but they live in the Caucasus. They are Armenians from the region of Malati. They are Amshensi and Mushti. These are the 3 groups that are not considered Caucasians, but everybody else in that region are Caucasians.
Yeah, I did expect countries like Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia, Russia, and Russian republics like Dagestan and Chechnya to overlap with the Caucasus Mountains. But I was surprised to find out there's also, and correct me if I'm wrong, that Turkey and Iran also overlap with the Caucasus Mountains. Am I right in saying that?
I believe there might be some areas that overlap. And there is a big population of Azerbaijanis who live in Iran, for example. There are some Circassians, the children of the refugees from the Caucasus War in the 19th century, who live in Turkey. So
yeah, it's really interesting to know, because I didn't know that at all. And I was also surprised that Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan didn't. I was surprised that the Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan didn't overlap with the Caucasus Mountains, which I thought that maybe they would have, but they don't. And I saw a post that you made about, the Scottish, English, Irish, Welsh, American, Canadian, and Australian people, etc., not truly being Caucasian, which is intriguing to say the least, because I have heard that word all my life, that they're Caucasian. Why do you think British, Western European, American, Canadian, and Australian people are not Caucasian, and why have they hijacked that term? What do you consider them to actually be?
I'm so glad you asked, because I'm very passionate about, let me put my water bottle. There was a German anthropologist named Johann Blumenbach. In the 18th century, he was studying skulls. Everybody has their own hobbies. His hobby was to study skulls. He came across a skull from the Caucasus, of a Georgian female, to be exact. He looked at that skull and he thought, I really like the structure of the skull. And in his mind, it exemplified his idea of the most beautiful human form. So in his logic, and unfortunately at that time, this thing like research and evidence collection was not very advanced, to say the least. But in his mind, he thought, okay, if this skull comes from the Caucasus, therefore Caucasus is the birthplace, of the prime race that linked to his idea of beauty. So nowadays, Caucasian is a catch-all for all the white people in the world, where in reality, what it does is very sinister. It actually erases the indigenous people of the Caucasus completely out of the social media, out of the research, out of the just everyday life. I can't say openly I'm Caucasian without having to give a lecture on why I'm saying it. And that is one of the reasons. Might ask, but how do white people call themselves? White? Another way they can say is European descendants. but definitely not Caucasians, because Caucasians are the people who originated from the Caucasus region.
Yeah, I think most people from Western Europe and North America would just describe themselves as white. But like I said, you do hear the term Caucasian being used quite frequently, which is interesting that, again, I was surprised to know that, because you just sort of go with the flow, don't you, of what people say. But it's really interesting, and I'm so glad that you're here to share the truth and what actually is in the history. But if we just take it back to mainland Russia for a moment, from what you've told us, there's a big difference between someone from Russian cities like Moscow or St. Petersburg and someone from the Caucasus Mountains. And to get even more specific, there are also differences between people from different parts of the mountain area. So as a Caucasian Muslim woman, what prejudice have you faced in Russia, if any?
So there's a couple of things here. Because I grew up in a very, I grew up in two worlds. In the Caucasian world, among my family, my relatives, my big family, I have 64 cousins.
Oh,
I also grew up around Russian people who were Orthodox Christian. So when I was around them, I remember I have experienced things like being told, go back to your country, being told that you are dark and you are black. In fact, I learned as far as my complexion and my race that I am considered in America white. I learned that in America. And I'll tell you a very quick story about this because this is hilarious. I went once on a bus to my workplace. I remember, I remember exactly. I think I work at a shop. And I had a conversation with an African American driver. He asked me, what's the situation in Russia? My English was pretty bad. Like the way I spoke back then was like this, that, this, that. But it's somehow when he spoke about politics, there were some things I could say. I just said, it's bad. People like me are called they're black. African American driver. He's looking at me, turning back, looking at me, and then he's like, uh-huh. And I realized at that moment was like, why is he reacting like this? But fast forward to a couple of years later, I realized that within the Russian community, when I was growing up, because I am slightly darker than the average Russian girl, what do you think of Russian as you think a Russian girl? Usually blonde hair, blue eyes, very light complexion. I realized that back then I was not considered as white as her, and therefore I was darker. So as a child, I had really terrible, I would say, insecurities that I'm not as good as them. And then I went into school. And at school, I think things got better because I had a lot of minorities in my school. We had Gypsies, we had Caucasians, we had Ukrainians as well. So things were getting a bit better from that perspective, although there was a lot of other things going on. But from the perspective of the ethnicity, I was safe. I started wearing hijab. When I started wearing hijab, then I became a target again. And there were a lot of terrible things, like I was hit, I was physically attacked, I was cussed out. But there were also very, very hilarious situations. Like there's sometimes when things are too bad, you can't help but laugh. So I will tell you also another story, if you're interested.
Yes.
I remember I was on my way to school. I was in 11th grade at that time, and I was wearing all black. And I'm seeing on the side, again, the side of my eye, I'm seeing that there are two Russian men that like walking like this. They're not very stable. I'm like, oh, okay, drunk people. And I was like, God, please, like, I hope I'm not gonna get in trouble or anything like that. Then I look again, and one of the guys, his eyes just locked on me. I was like, and I'm starting to make dua. I was like, Ya Rab, there is no way to go to the left. There is no way to go to the right. Just straight. Please protect me. As I'm making the dua, that guy who was locked in with me, he just comes up in front of me like this. He looks at me like that, and he says, Mother, bless me. In Orthodox Christianity, if I do this, I am what's considered a matushka, a mother. I'm a monastery goer. I'm a devoted Christian woman. In split second, I look at him and I'm like, I bless you, my son.
Very smart. Very, very smart. I would do the same. Yes, that's good. Very smart. Yeah. Well, you could have still blessed him from Alyssa Adala instead of from. He just doesn't know. Oh, that's so funny. But also scary, like also very scary. I mean, the level of discrimination you described is quite shocking. And, for a young girl to be out just because you're wearing hijab, to be in that moment a little bit scared, to be scared is, it's not fair. It's not right. And I think from, what you said, there is definitely some anti-Muslim sentiment there as well. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, protect all the Muslims in Russia from the hardships that they face. And I'm glad that you, like I said, you're in a safe place now. But we've spoken a little bit about conflicts and tensions in that region. But one very prominent one, obviously, is Russia and Ukraine. And I'll be honest, sister, as Muslims, we don't trust a word the mainstream media say, because they portray us in such a negative manner. So I've always been skeptical to believe the media about Ukraine because of how they report on Palestine and Israel. But what are your personal thoughts on the Ukraine situation? And is Zelensky trustworthy or not?
So I think with Ukraine, the conflict didn't start there on February 24th, 2022. Just like the situation in Gaza did not start on October 7th last year,
yeah.
And just like with any conflict in general, or anything in life, really, like even a divorce or a breakup, like things really just happen out of the blue. And, I say this to say, Ukraine has suffered tremendously under the USSR regime, as have a lot of ethnicities and republics that were part of the USSR. One interesting thing that I think really puts this in perspective, during the, I'm trying to remember the name of this group. I think it's UPA, I think it's called Ukrainian Insurgent Army, excuse me. During the World War II, there was a group called Ukrainian Insurgent Army. They fought, as they're fighting against the Nazis, they also fought against the Soviets at the same time. They were fighting on two fronts. And as they were doing this, they were defeated over and over again. They also created dissident movements. I remember one of my acquaintances mentioning to me that there was almost like an underground movement, an underground network, like Hamas tunnels, if I may say this, because they were also a group of people who were distributing what was considered illegal literature. They had a culture branch that was making sure that Ukrainian language is not forgotten and that Ukrainian culture is not forgotten. There was armed resistance as well, done by the insurgent army, as well as there was a group called Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. They both were what you consider military resistance. So across the board, Ukrainians have had this experience of fighting using military force against the USSR and also ideologically. So it didn't happen in a vacuum. As far as the Zelensky goes, I think because of the historical context that I've shared with you of how so many nations that became part of Russia as a result of the expansionary politics, they want to choose for themselves for the first time in their life. And as I've heard from a lot of people who are from ex-USSR countries, they even say, if they win, maybe we will win. So this is one opinion that people hold, that looking at the course that Ukraine is taking might hope for them as well to change their course internally. Because like I mentioned again, regardless of what camp you are in, if you really understand history, it doesn't go anywhere. Historical legacy lingers.
Yeah, I think most politicians have an element of dishonesty in them, to be honest, and I think it just comes with the job description. But I can understand if you've been oppressed for so long, you will believe in someone that's telling you they'll get you out of that oppression. But personally, I think the US are funding a proxy war with Russia through Ukraine, and I've heard Zelensky is a Zionist, so I don't completely trust him. But to be fair, other people have also said both nations are just as bad as each other. There's so much information, or there's so much rumor, shall we say, out there that you just don't know what to believe. But I want to sort of shift to something more positive. You know, we mentioned the UFC fighters and
Yeah.
people from the West, you know, associate with Russia. So what are your thoughts on, you know, brother Khabib, Khamzat and Islam? What do you think about the UFC fighters that have now come up?
Oh, I admire them. I
Mm,
think they recently, with the success that they had, I think they definitely revived the image of Caucasians in the world, especially in the Muslim world. And it's kind of crazy to see that the places that I know, like Dagestan, people know as well now who are outside
mm,
of the region. It's almost like, I was thinking about this today, like when the Iron Curtain fell and people start to learn about Russians, um, the minorities within Russia didn't get the
mm,
same chance. They are almost like feels like the Iron Curtain just fell, just came down for the
mm,
region that I'm from. So it's very inspiring, but it's also time for us to push forward
mm,
because we're not just UFC fighters. We're also poets. There is one person comes to mind, Rasul Gamzatov.
mm,
We have beautiful dances. I really, really want people to know about our dances, just like they know about Dabke, just like
mm,
they know about the Haku dance of New Zealand. We also, scientists and we are politicians. We are religious leaders.
mm,
Honest, there's a couple of people, imams specifically, that I think should be studied by the world, not just Muslims, but the West as well.
mm,
The reason I say this is because one of them, his name is Abu Umar Sasitlinsky, he was able to penetrate the cement wall of legacy, this expansionist legacy, even internal Russian propaganda, to give people hope that they
mm,
can have a better socio-economical conditions, as
mm,
well as easier time spreading and practicing Islam. So
mm.
me personally, to be able to do that and stay alive, that's an accomplishment
Yes.
equal, if not far greater than winning in an octagon.
No, definitely. And I'm so glad that you shed light on the other people in the Caucasus Mountains that are successful. And I encourage people to do their research and to learn more about these people. But I think a lot of people, you know, like you said, a lot of people know the UFC fighters, you know, are from Dagestan because that's where Khabib is from. So they've heard about Dagestan. They've, you know, Khamzat is from Chechen. So, you know, they learn about that. I think Brother Islam is also from Dagestan. Obviously, these days they live in the UAE. I think Khabib is leaving for political reasons. But it's nice that they're shedding a light on that area, and they're genuinely Muslims. You know, they're genuinely fighting for Muslims around the world, and that's such a positive. Because sometimes when people fall into these roles, they sometimes move away from Islam to further themselves. But no, they've stuck to their guns. So it's amazing to see.
I want to add something on this. I think
Yeah.
in general, with everything in life, it's always good to look at existing frame of reference.
Mm,
Why do I say this in regards to the UFC fighters? When I moved to United States, I learned about Muhammad Ali.
mm,
I watched this movie called Ali. I actually met his daughter when I lived in New York, and she's gorgeous.
mm,
And when I learned about his history and the fact that he refused to go to war and he lost his title and his belt
mm,
because he didn't want to kill anyone in Vietnam, I
mm,
thought to myself, whoa, that's a great example.
mm,
And I can't help but think sometimes when I take this frame of reference, shouldn't we ask of our famous people to do more in
mm,
regards to the Muslim men being, in some cases, kidnapped and forced to go to Ukraine? So that's a rhetorical question. I don't have an answer to it, but
mm,
I think what's really important when you're trying to find answer to anything is start looking at existing frame of references because
mm,
there's so much that people have done already. We're not inventing any wheels anymore,
mm,
and there's a lot that you can learn from history from other countries.
mhm,
Truly, I'm
mm,
reading a book right now called Fear. Fear is just a word about Miriam Rodriguez. She is a woman who was tracking down the killers of her daughter in Mexico,
mm,
and I realized that, wow, a lot of corruption that she's experienced is also what my family has been experiencing and is experiencing in Russia. So I say this to say, it's good to know what's happening in other places on the world to be able to find the truth for yourself.
No, definitely. I definitely agree. I just wanted to say, if you wanted to come back to the question about why your family moved to Russia, or would you like to skip it? Just wanted to give you that option before we get to sort of the last question.
No, I think I covered the main things.
Yeah. So I mean, you're definitely informed and enlightened the viewers about, Muslims from the Caucasus Mountains, the former Soviet Union, and Russia, from what you've shared with us today. And like I said, it's been really interesting today. This conversation has been really interesting. But how can Muslims from all over the world, help and support our brothers and sisters in Russia and the former Soviet Union?
I think my answer is going to be a bit pessimistic. How can Muslims in the West and in the world help us when they are being cancelled right and left for being pro-Palestinian? Or how can Arab Muslims help us when they're being politically persecuted in their own Arab countries by the unjust leaders? I think about this a lot. When I look to our communities, I see lack, I see weakness, I see despair. I mean, I love to read books. So there's one thing I want to recommend before we end, is this book called Guantanamo Diaries by Mohammed. In this book, it talks a lot about how some of the Arab nations, specifically Jordan, has been helping with the military intelligence when it comes to spying on Muslims. And it works directly with USSR, with America. When I read things like that, when I learn about the specifics of the inner workings in the world, I think to myself, it's not black and white. If we reach out, for example, to the Arab nations and ask them for help, they're struggling too. If we ask Muslims in the West to do something, they're losing their livelihoods over Palestine. They're getting cancelled or even killed. So the only thing I can ask without feeling guilty is, next time when you go to the mosque during Ramadan, ask Imam to mention Chechnya, Dagestan, Kazakhstan, Tatarstan in the dua during Salatul Witr.
Inshallah.
Why I say this? I went to one mosque, it's called Al-Sunnah, and I remember during Ramadan we were praying, and most of us don't speak Arabic, by the way. Most of us don't speak Arabic. Or if we speak the Quranic Arabic. And I'm praying, and I just, listening to what the dua says, and I hear Chechnya. Trust me, the people in the audience, when in the Taraweeh, when they hear the name of Dagestan, Chechnya, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, you will make them feel seen. To start.
Inshallah, I definitely encourage people to do that, and to even just do a dua for everybody over there in your own personal homes and your own personal prayers. But I want to say, I'm a lot more sympathetic towards Muslims over there, especially towards, Ukraine, now that you've informed us of the situation. And I trust a Muslim's opinion, a Muslim's words more than I do the media. So I'm so glad that you've come on today. And I would urge everybody watching to, raise awareness for our brothers and sisters in these regions and to help support them in any way you can. I know that, Palestine is such a big part of everybody's life just now, but it's important to know that there are Muslims all over the world that are suffering, and to shed light on all of the Muslims. And of course, what's happening in Palestine is horrific just now, but like I said, everybody needs our help. So please, if you are doing dua, do dua for all of us, do dua for the ummah, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, ease the pain of those that are suffering. And please also go and subscribe to the sisters channel. It's called the Refugee from Russia podcast. It's a really good channel, and like I said, sister, you're doing such good work, and you're really doing a lot to raise awareness for the Caucasian Mountains and people over there, and Muslims in Russia, and just giving such good interesting knowledge of the history over there, stuff that I didn't even know. So thank you so much for coming today, and I really appreciate you taking the time out to speak to me. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless you and your family and give you much success, inshallah.
You as well. I was going to say the same. Thank you so much for the opportunity. I appreciate you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, everyone. I hope everyone has a lovely evening.
Wa alaikum salam.